All right, this passage is titled The Roach. If Mona can face this, she can face anything. Okay, so we're specifically going to be looking for figurative language. If you just watch the presentations, you'll see this is a review. So onomatopoeia, those were our words that imitate the sounds they describe, like hiss, buzz, woof. A simile compares two unlike things to show a quality or aspect of one of those things. Similes use like or as. An example would be, Stephen's voice sounds like melted chocolate. The metaphor works just like a simile, but without using like or as. The example would be, Stephen's voice is melted chocolate. Okay, the difference would be, for a simile we use like, and for a metaphor we do not. Okay, so obviously we're not going to underline because we don't have the hard copy of the magazine. Whoosh, a whisper of wind across her cheek jolted Mona awake. As she blinked in the darkness, she felt a tickle on her forehead. She thought about turning on the light, but then she'd have to face the facts. So she lay still, her heart thumping so loud it shook the bed. Here were the facts. A cockroach just scurried across her face. Yesterday, her brother Edward left for college. Mona didn't know which was worse. Mona's house was infested with roaches, like all the houses in her neighborhood were. Just that morning, a roach had dropped like a bomb from the faucet while Mona brushed her teeth. Unfortunately, the exterminator couldn't come for another 3 days. In the meantime, the roaches multiplied. They scattered by the dozens, and when the porch light flicked on. They lurked in cupboards and shoes and under pillows and sinks. Edward had made it his mission to search and destroy the invaders. Sometimes he stomped on them. With a sickening pop, they'd explode into what looked to Mona like tiny piles of mashed potatoes. Sometimes he whacked them with a spatula. Once he smashed one with his bare hand and scraped bits of mangled exoskeleton into the trash, as if scraping food off a plate. As Mona lay in bed imagining the roach skittering around her room on its sticky legs, she thought about springing out of bed to get Edward. Then she remembered he wasn't there anymore. Ever since their parents divorced and they only saw their dad in the summers, it had been Edward who cleaned up messes, drove her to piano lessons, packed her lunch. Not that her mom didn't want to do those things, but she drove a rig and on long hauls like the one she was on now, she wasn't around at night. She'd roll home in the morning, her eyes tired but her smile bright. Inevitably, Edward had a pot of coffee brewing for her. On those early mornings, Edward and Mona would sit at the kitchen table, waiting for their mom and talking all about the adventures they'd have someday. They said they'd explore ancient temples in Cambodia, see penguins in Antarctica, trek through the Amazon rainforest. It had never occurred to Mona that Edward would leave and have an adventure without her. Which was silly. Mona now understood. He was 5 years older than her, after all. Mona thought about Edward's dinky car stuffed with clothes and bedding, the Steph Curry posters she gave him, and probably, let's be honest, a few stowaway roaches. She thought about how Edward wasn't around anymore to brew coffee and smash bugs and pack lunches. She thought about how she would have to do those things now, and she wondered if a peanut butter sandwich she made herself could ever taste as good as one Edward made. Mona took a breath and flicked on the light. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye. She spied the caramel curve of a wing protruding from the bottom of her backpack. Could she step on the roach, throw a book at it, pack her things, and move to Iceland? Mona grabbed an empty glass from her nightstand and perched at the foot of her bed, a cat waiting to pounce. For one agonizing moment, Mona and the roach remained perfectly still, locked in a deadly game of who would move first. And then Mona sprang into the air. She kicked her backpack out of the way. The roach took off, a missile shooting across the floor. But Mona was faster. She brought the glass down, thud, The roach was trapped. As Mona watched it struggle, slamming itself against the sides of the glass in a frenzy, something strange happened. The roach didn't seem so gross. What had the roach ever done to her? It wasn't his fault it was there. It was just doing what roaches do. Carefully, Mona slid a sheet of paper under the glass and flipped it over. The roach stopped moving. Maybe it knew what was about to happen. A few moments later, Mona stood on the front lawn. Purple and pink streaked across the early morning sky like paint on an infinite canvas. Soon, Mona knew the colors would be gone and the day would begin. She bent down and pulled the paper off the glass. The cockroach crawled out and lifted its antennas, smelling its freedom, then bolted into the dawn. Suddenly, Mona remembered an old saying her mom had tacked on the fridge. Don't cry because it's over. Smile because it happened. Mona turned back. Her mom would be home soon, and Mona would have coffee waiting for her. And as the warm, comforting smell filled the house, she would think of all those early mornings with Edward and smile.